There is a road in West Virginia that most people never take. Not because it is blocked, not because it is hidden, but because the people who know about it don't give directions. If you ask around, you won't get a clear answer. You will get hesitation, a pause, sometimes a warning, and sometimes nothing at all. Because there are certain stories that communities don't tell out loud. Not because they are secrets, but because no one knows how to explain them properly. This is one of those stories. It begins in the mountains of West Virginia, in a place where the landscape looks untouched by time. When people imagine America, they think of cities, glass buildings, traffic, speed. But this part of the country moves differently. There are hills that stretch for miles, forests that swallow sound, roads that turn into dirt without warning, and communities where everyone knows everyone, places where generations stay, where leaving is not always simple, and where outsiders are noticed immediately. In places like this, stories don't spread through the internet. They spread through silence, through the way people react when a name is mentioned, through what is not said. And there was one family that carried that kind of silence. People knew of them, but they didn't talk about them directly. If you asked, you might hear something like, "Best to leave them alone," or "You don't need to go up there." No clear explanation, no detailed warning, just a feeling that crossing that line would take you somewhere unfamiliar. For years, that's where the story stayed. Local, unspoken, contained, until someone from the outside decided to look for himself. His name was Mark. He wasn't a journalist chasing headlines. He wasn't looking for something dramatic. He was a photographer, someone who spent time documenting people who lived outside the typical frame of society. People who were often overlooked, ignored, or misunderstood. That was his focus. Not spectacle, observation. So when he heard about this family, it didn't sound like a mystery. It sounded like a story no one had taken the time to understand. At first, the descriptions seemed exaggerated. Stories often grow in isolated places. Details shift. Rumors expand. So he did what he always did. He went to see for himself. He drove into West Virginia, away from the main roads, past the towns, past the places where GPS still makes sense. The roads narrowed, the pavement faded, and eventually it turned into dirt. The kind of road that feels less like a destination and more like a question. He started asking for directions. That's when things changed. People didn't answer normally. Some avoided eye contact. Some gave short responses. Some asked why he wanted to go there, and a few simply told him not to. Not aggressively, but firmly, like they had seen what happens when outsiders get too curious. Now think about that moment, because this is where most people turn around. When the warnings become consistent, when the answers stop making sense, when the atmosphere shifts. But Mark didn't turn around, not because he ignored the warnings, but because he recognized something inside them. Not danger, protection. There's a difference, and he understood that difference mattered. So he kept going, further down the road, until the houses became fewer, the silence deeper, the space between structures wider. And then he saw it. A house. Old, worn, not abandoned, but not maintained in the way most people expect. The kind of place that tells a story before anyone speaks. He stopped, stepped out, and walked toward it. Now here is where expectations break. Because when people imagine moments like this, they imagine fear, tension, something cinematic. But what he felt was something else. Displacement, like stepping into a space that operates under a different set of rules. Then someone came out, not in a way that matched what he was used to. The movement, the posture, the communication. It wasn't what most people would call normal. But it wasn't chaos either. It was structured, just unfamiliar. And that's the key difference. Because unfamiliar is not the same as wrong. It just means you don't understand it yet. He didn't rush. He didn't react. He observed, because that's what he came to do. Not to judge, not to interrupt, to see. And what he saw was not what the stories had suggested. It wasn't a scene. It wasn't a spectacle. It was a family, living, existing, communicating in ways that didn't follow typical patterns. Some spoke. Some didn't. Some used sounds, gestures, expressions. To outsiders, it might have seemed confusing. But inside that space, there was structure. There was recognition. There was connection. And that's the part people often miss. Because when something doesn't look familiar, the instinct is to label it, to simplify it, to explain it quickly. But what Mark understood in that moment was something slower. This wasn't a story you could understand at a glance. This wasn't something you could reduce to a single explanation. So he did what most people don't do. He stayed, not for hours, not for a quick impression. He returned, again and again, because trust doesn't appear in one visit, especially in places where outsiders are not easily accepted. And over time, something changed. The distance reduced. Not completely, but enough. Enough to begin documenting. Carefully, respectfully, without forcing anything. He took photographs, not to make something look shocking, but to show what was there. And when those images were finally seen by the world, everything shifted. Because now the story was no longer local. It was global. People saw the images, and they reacted. Some with sympathy, some with confusion, some with curiosity, and some with judgment. But almost everyone asked the same question. What happened to this family? Because what they saw didn't fit into simple categories. It wasn't just poverty. It wasn't just isolation. It wasn't something people could explain in one sentence. And that is where the story really begins. Not with what was seen, but with what people thought they understood, and what they didn't. Comment one word. Curious if you would have kept going like Mark. Tone back if you think you would have left after the warnings. Or unsure if you don't know what you would have done. Because the next part is where the explanations begin, and where they start to break apart. When the images reached the public, people didn't just look at them. They reacted. And the reactions followed a pattern that says more about the viewers than the family itself. Some people felt immediate sympathy. They saw hardship, isolation, a life that seemed far removed from what they understood as normal. Others felt shock. They focused on the differences, the sounds, the behavior, the way communication didn't follow the rules they were used to. And then there was a third group, the ones who didn't know how to feel. Because what they were seeing didn't fit into a clean category. It wasn't a clear tragedy. It wasn't a simple case of poverty. It wasn't something they could explain in a sentence and move on from. And when people don't understand something, they search for explanations. Fast ones, simple ones, comfortable ones. That's when a single word began to dominate the conversation. Inbreeding. It became the explanation people held on to. Because it sounded scientific, definitive, like it answered everything. But here's the problem. It didn't. It explained part of the situation, but not the whole story. To understand why that explanation spread so quickly, you have to understand how people think about genetics. Inside every human body are instructions, genes. They determine how the body develops, how the brain functions, how certain traits appear. Some of those genes are dominant. They show up easily. Others are recessive. They stay hidden unless both parents carry the same one. Now, in most populations, the chances of two people carrying the exact same rare recessive gene are relatively low. But in isolated communities, those chances increase. Not because people are doing something extreme, but because the pool of genetic variation is smaller. Over time, certain traits can become more common. Certain conditions can appear more frequently. That part is real. That part is documented. But what people often misunderstand is this. Genetics is not a single switch. It's not one cause, one result. It's a complex system, and reducing an entire family's condition to one word oversimplifies everything. Because what Mark saw wasn't just genetics. It was environment. It was isolation. It was lack of access. It was generations of living in a place where support systems were limited. Think about that for a moment. What happens when a family lives in a remote area for decades, where healthcare is not easily available, where education is inconsistent, where intervention never arrives early enough, where conditions that could be managed in other environments go untreated? They don't dissipate. They accumulate, slowly, quietly, until they become part of daily life. That's the part most viewers never saw, because the camera captures a moment, not a timeline, and timelines are where understanding lives. So while the internet focused on one explanation, the reality was layered. Biology played a role, but so did everything else. And ignoring those layers makes the story easier to consume, but harder to understand. Now here's where things take another turn. Because the more attention the family received, the more people started asking a different question. Not just what happened to them, but how they lived. Because despite everything people assumed, there was something unexpected in the footage. They weren't alone. They weren't disconnected from each other. They interacted. They responded. They recognized one another. And in their own way, they communicated. It didn't follow standard language. It didn't sound like typical conversation, but it worked for them. There were patterns, reactions, signals, a system that had developed over time. To outsiders, it sounded like noise, but inside that space, it carried meaning. And that challenges another assumption people often make: that communication only exists in one form, words. But communication is much broader than that. It includes tone, movement, expression, repetition, timing. People adapt, especially when traditional systems are not available to them. And that's what seems to have happened here. Over time, a different kind of communication formed. Not taught, not structured in a formal way, but built through necessity, through living together, through shared experience. And that's something most viewers miss completely, because they weren't looking for it. They were looking for something to confirm what they already believed. Now step back for a second, because this is where the story becomes uncomfortable. Not because of the family, but because of the reaction to them. When the videos spread, they didn't just bring attention. They brought exposure. And exposure is not always neutral. It can help. It can bring support. But it can also change the environment it enters. Because once a private life becomes public, it stops being controlled by the people living it. It becomes something others interact with, comment on, interpret, sometimes misunderstand, and sometimes exploit. The family didn't ask for that level of attention. They didn't create content. They didn't present themselves to the world. They were documented. And once that documentation spread, it created something new. A narrative, a version of their life that people believed they understood, even if they had only seen a few minutes of it. And that raises a difficult question. When does observation turn into consumption? Because there's a difference. Observation tries to understand. Consumption just reacts. And much of the internet operates on reaction. Quick judgments, short attention spans, strong opinions with limited information. That's how stories get shaped. Not by depth, but by speed. Now think about what that does to a situation like this. A complex, layered reality gets compressed into a few dominant ideas. Inbreeding, isolation, shock value, and everything else gets pushed aside. The daily life, the relationships, the small moments of normalcy, the parts that don't fit the narrative, they dissipate because they don't generate the same reaction. And that's where the real distortion happens. Not in what is shown, but in what is ignored. Now, to be clear, Attention did bring some positive outcomes. People became aware. Some offered help. Donations started coming in. Resources that were never available before suddenly appeared. And that's important, because without visibility, those opportunities might never have existed. But visibility is not a simple solution. It's a trade-off, because what it gives in support, it can take in privacy. And that balance is not easy to manage, especially for a family that had lived outside of public attention for so long. Now imagine being placed in that situation, where your life becomes something people discuss, analyze, debate, without fully knowing you, without fully understanding your reality. That's the part that doesn't show up clearly in the footage. But it's there, in the background, shaping everything that comes next. And this is where the story begins to shift again. Because what started as documentation began to turn into something else. Something larger, more complicated, more unpredictable. Because once the world starts watching, it doesn't always know when to stop. And the next part of this story is not just about what people saw. It's about what happened after. Comment below. Do you think attention like this helps more than it harms? Or does it cross a line we don't fully understand? Because in the next part, things go deeper into what the cameras didn't show and what started happening behind the scenes. What happened after the video spread is where the story becomes harder to follow. Not because there's no information, but because there's too much of it. Too many voices, too many claims, too many people trying to define what was happening from the outside. At first, the attention looked like help. Donations came in. People offered support. There was talk of improving living conditions, fixing the house, providing better care. And for a moment, it seemed like the situation might actually change. But change is never just about resources. It's about structure, about consistency, about who controls what happens next. And that's where things began to shift. Because as more people became involved, the situation didn't become clearer. It became fragmented. Different individuals started stepping in, some with good intentions, some with unclear motives, some simply trying to be part of something that had already captured public attention. And slowly, without anyone announcing it, the focus began to move away from the family and toward the people around them. That's a subtle change, but it matters, because once that happens, the story stops being about helping and starts becoming about influence. Who is in charge? Who decides what's best? Who speaks for the family? Who manages the money? Who controls access? Those questions don't stay in the background for long. They move to the center, and when they do, conflict follows, because there's no single authority. No clear system, no agreed structure, just overlapping roles and assumptions. And that's where confusion turns into tension. Supporters began noticing inconsistencies. Updates didn't always match. Plans changed. Promises were made, but not always fulfilled. And when people started asking questions, the answers weren't always clear. Some explanations felt incomplete. Others raised even more questions. And gradually, trust began to erode. Not all at once, but in small moments. A detail that didn't add up. A timeline that didn't make sense. A lack of transparency where people expected clarity. And once doubt enters a situation like this, it spreads quickly. Because the internet doesn't wait. It reacts, speculates, builds narratives in real time. And those narratives don't need to be accurate to gain traction. They just need to be compelling. That's how the situation escalated. Not through one major event, but through accumulation, layer after layer of uncertainty, until the original focus, the family, was almost lost inside the noise. Now here's the part most people don't consider. The family didn't change. Their needs didn't suddenly become different. Their daily reality didn't pause while all of this unfolded, but the environment around them did. And when the environment becomes unstable, everything connected to it feels that instability, even if the people at the center don't fully understand why. Because stability isn't just about physical conditions. It's about predictability, routine, consistency, knowing what comes next. And when those things disappear, even small disruptions can have larger effects. Now think about that in the context of this situation. More visitors, more attention, more movement, more voices, more decisions being made around them. That's not a neutral change. That's pressure. And pressure doesn't always show up in obvious ways. Sometimes it looks like confusion. Sometimes like withdrawal. Sometimes like changes in behavior that people misinterpret. And that's where another layer of misunderstanding can begin. Because when behavior changes, people often look for simple explanations. But the cause is rarely simple. It's usually a response to something deeper, something less visible. Now add another factor to this: accountability. Because once money is involved, expectations change. People want to know where it's going, how it's being used, who is responsible for it. And those are fake questions, necessary questions, but they require clear answers, documentation, transparency, structure. Without that, suspicion grows. And once suspicion becomes public, it doesn't stay contained. It spreads through comments, through posts, through discussions that reach far beyond the original audience. And that's when the situation moves into a different phase. Not just attention, but scrutiny. Not just support, but investigation. People start looking closer, comparing statements, tracking timelines, analyzing details, trying to piece together what's actually happening. And when they can't find clear answers, they create their own conclusions. Right or wrong, those conclusions begin to shape the narrative. And once a narrative forms, it's difficult to reverse, even if new information appears later. Because first impressions tend to stick, especially when they are tied to emotion. Now here's where things become even more complicated. Because while all of this is happening publicly, there are also things happening privately. Decisions being made behind the scenes. Conversations that aren't recorded. Actions that don't get posted online. And those unseen elements often matter the most. But they are also the hardest to verify, which means they become the most vulnerable to speculation. And speculation fills gaps, even when it shouldn't. Now step back again. Look at the full picture. A family living in isolation, suddenly exposed to global attention. Support arrives, but so does complexity. More people get involved. Roles become unclear. Questions begin. Trust shifts. Narratives form. And the original goal, helping, gets buried under everything else. That's not unusual. It's a pattern. One that repeats in situations where visibility increases faster than structure. Because attention moves quickly, but stability takes time. And when those two aren't aligned, problems emerge. Now consider one more layer. Control. Because in any situation like this, someone ends up controlling key elements. Access, information, decisions, resources, and control, even when well-intentioned, can become problematic if it isn't shared or monitored. Because it creates dependency. And dependency, without oversight, creates risk. That doesn't mean wrongdoing automatically exists, but it means the conditions for misunderstanding and conflict are present. And in this case, those conditions were clearly there. Now here's the question that begins to surface. At what point does helping turn into something else? Not intentionally, not deliberately, but gradually. Through small shifts, through decisions that seem minor at the time, through changes that feel justified in the moment, until the situation looks very different from where it started. That's what makes this part of the story difficult. There's no single moment where everything changes. No clear line between right and wrong. just a series of developments that lead to a more complicated reality. And by the time people realize that complexity, it's already established. Now, as this unfolds, something else begins to happen. External involvement. Because when situations reach a certain level of visibility and concern, they attract attention from institutions, authorities, organizations, people whose role is to assess risk and ensure safety. And their involvement changes everything. Because they don't operate on assumptions. They look for evidence, patterns, indicators that something requires intervention. And when they step in, the situation moves out of public control into a structured process, one that doesn't always share details openly, which can make things feel even more uncertain from the outside. Because now there are fewer updates, less visibility, more silence, and silence in a situation already filled with questions can feel unsettling. People start asking, what happened? Why did things change? Who made the decision? Was it necessary? Was it too late? Was it the right call? But answers don't come quickly, because these processes take time, and not everything can be shared publicly, which leaves a gap, and that gap gets filled the same way it always does, with speculation, with assumptions, with narratives that may or may not reflect reality. Now we're at a point where the story is no longer just about a family. It's about everything surrounding them. The attention, the reactions, the involvement, the consequences. And that's where the next part begins. Because once intervention happens, the situation doesn't end. It changes form. And what comes next raises even more questions than before. Questions about outcome, about impact, about whether the attention helped or made things harder in ways people didn't anticipate. Comment below. Do you think situations like this can ever stay controlled once the internet gets involved? Or is the outcome always unpredictable? Because in the next part, we'll look at what happened after everything shifted, and why the ending is not as simple as people expect. After everything shifted, people expected clarity, a clear outcome, a simple answer, something they could point to and say, this is what happened. But that's not what they got. What followed was quieter, less visible, more structured, and harder to understand from the outside. Because once the situation moved out of public hands, the updates slowed down. The noise faded, and in that silence, something important happened. Stability began to return. Not instantly, not perfectly, but gradually. The kind of change that doesn't show up in viral clips or headlines. The kind that builds in routines, in consistent care, in environments designed for safety rather than survival. And for the first time, the story stopped moving at the speed of the internet. It slowed down to the pace of real life, where progress is measured in small steps, not dramatic moments. But that shift created a different kind of tension. Because while conditions may have improved, something else was lost. Familiarity, the place they had always known, the routines they had built over years, the faces they recognized without needing explanation. And that raises a difficult question. When a situation changes for the better on paper, does it always feel better for the people living through it? Because improvement isn't just about physical conditions. It's about emotional continuity, about whether the new environment replaces what was lost, or simply removes it. And that's something no outsider can fully measure. From the outside, people look for clear outcomes, better or worse, success or failure. But reality doesn't work that way. It's layered, complicated. Sometimes both things exist at the same time. Safer conditions, but unfamiliar surroundings. More support, but less independence. More structure, but less control. And those trade-offs don't resolve neatly. Now step back one final time. What started as a hidden life became public. What became public attracted attention. Attention brought support, but also complexity. Complexity led to intervention, and intervention led to change. Not a clean ending, but a transformation. And maybe that's the point most people miss. This was never a story with a simple conclusion. It was a chain reaction, where every step created the conditions for the next. And once that process started, it couldn't just be reversed. So the real question isn't what happened. It's what we learned from watching it happen. Because stories like this don't just reveal something about the people inside them. They reveal something about the people watching. What we focus on, what we ignore, what we assume, what we question, and whether we are trying to understand or just trying to react. Comment below. After everything you've heard, do you think the exposure helped this family or changed their lives in ways we still don't fully understand? Because sometimes the biggest impact of a story isn't what it shows, but what it leaves unresolved. Thank you for watching this video. Click here to watch another video that might interest you.